I'd very much always try and frame it as like, how can this be a learning opportunity to the developer and the development team as a whole, rather than like this developer made a mistake, they need to learn not to do it again, or we're going to fire them. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of silly coding mistakes I found, and because that install count was much lower, you get to see a lot of the stuff that hasn't really had many eyes looking over it.
Stealthcopter, right? So that's your nickname. You're known in the security space by this nickname. Hello, everyone. My name is Maciej Nowak, and welcome to the Awesome to Know podcast, where we discuss all things related to building a great website. In this episode, we are diving into fascinating world of bug bounties with our guest Matt Rawlings, a security expert known in the community as Stealthcopter. Matt will take us through his journey from developer to full-time bug bounty hunter, sharing insights on vulnerability discovery, WordPress security, and the art of spotting overlooked flaws in the code. We will explore the value of bug bounties for companies, the common mistakes developers make, and how he is helping to shape a safer ecosystem for everyone. Get ready for an eye-opening conversation on the hidden side of web security. If you don't want to miss new episodes and keep learning, please subscribe to our newsletter at awesomstudio.com/newsletter. This is osomstudio.com/newsletter. If you are watching us on YouTube, subscribe to the channel and give a thumb. This means a lot to us. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Matt Rawlings.
Hey everyone, it's good to have you here. We're glad you decided to tune in for this episode of the Awesome to Know podcast.
Hi, Matt. I'm happy to have you on the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Can you explain to our listeners what bug bounty is, so that everyone can get a gist of what we are going to talk about today?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, so bug bounty is where companies will pay cybersecurity experts, hackers, developers to find vulnerabilities in their software or websites or general any kind of programs that they deem critical to their day-to-day running of the business. Anything that has like personal data behind, they'll offer bounties up. So they'll put a price on getting into certain systems or hacking certain things. In the case of WordPress, certain plugins and themes. And if you can demonstrate to them how to hack in an impactful way their software, they'll give you a monetary reward. So it's a great way as a security researcher to be able to make income while also securing the ecosystem.
All right. And why would companies would like to do that?
Well, it's basically a cheaper way of managing cybersecurity threats. So if some bad actors, so you could have spammers, cyber criminals, if they attacked your website, they could do real financial damage to your reputation, to your website, to your customers. So if you can pay cybersecurity researchers to do this for you, show you how it's done, help you fix it, then you're effectively saving money and saving reputational damage.
It's like outsourcing security to outside people, something like this.
Yeah, perfect.
But at the same time, I'm thinking about, isn't it like blind spot if you rely on bounties too much? I'm not saying this is the case, but it's like the internal team is not sufficient in these cases.
Yeah, so bug bounty tends to come at quite a mature stage of like a cybersecurity and within a company. So typically with a normal company, you would have pen tests where you either have an internal team or you hire a third party to come and review your either review your code, review your network infrastructure, and try and break into things within a specific scope. And so it's not kind of something that's designed to replace other security stuff. It's kind of an additional step. So it helps you get that security and depth, which is what you really want. So yeah, you shouldn't rely on it as like just to solve all your problems, but it's a really good way of being able, because if you have like a massive public scope, you're going to have so many more eyes on your code and your network than you would by just having like typically you'd have like 1 or 2 pen tests a year. So if you open up this scope for a bug bounty program, you're probably going to find lots more vulnerabilities that might be missed during a penetration test or other security reviews.
You mentioned the public facing part, so you have many customers and so on, many eyes looking at the code, and I think this happens with open source a lot, where there's a potential that there are many people looking at it. At the same time, it's the second edge of the same sword, where a lot of hackers are doing the same thing, and there is always the discussion whether working on top of open source software is safe approach or better use a technology that is closed source, for example. And what are your takes on it?
Yeah, I mean, it can be a double-edged sword because any adversary could have the source code, so they may be able to develop those exploits easier. But I don't think it's a good argument that just because it's closed source, an attacker wouldn't be able to develop an exploit for it. It might increase the costs to an attacker to do it. But you're also then, if you're relying on your source code not being leaked, that's probably quite a bad stance for a company to take, because there's been a lot of instances where source code to private companies has been leaked. And if an attacker is determined enough, they'll just reverse engineer your source code anyway.
All right. And one of the most recent, I think, vulnerabilities you have uncovered, let's say, was in WPML, right? The plugin, which is very popular in WordPress ecosystem. There was a lot of, let's say, press coverage about that. And can you tell us a little bit more? How did you come across this particular vulnerability?
Yeah, so this one, I wasn't specifically looking for this type of vulnerability that I found. So this was one of the plugin was one of the more popular plugins that isn't distributed via WordPress.org. So this is something that interested me because I just started having a look at those more popular plugins where there may not be as many eyes on the source code. Because for WordPress, like even if you don't distribute via the public WordPress.org repo, your source code is still open source because you can just read the PHP code once you've been given the zip to download. So I was just having a look through there. I'd recently learnt what shortcodes were in WordPress, which for any WordPress experts is probably very obvious, but to me it was something that was quite new. So I was looking for the more typical things you see with shortcodes. So quite commonly, you see a lot of cross-site scripting where developers aren't protecting thoroughly against injection of JavaScript and HTML. And the other one I was looking for is local file inclusion. So if there's any attributes in that shortcode that I put into a path with include or require or get template, those can include other PHP files and you can exploit that as an attacker. But this one was a bit more interesting. So I'd gone looking for these cross-site scripting and these local file inclusion attacks, and I'd found that this shortcode was actually rendering a template. And one of my favorite vulnerabilities is called SSTI, which is server-side template injection. And this is where you can define a template yourself that calls some of the commands that templating engine defines, and you can use these commands to get arbitrary code execution. So you'd be able to take full control of the server. So it was quite a complicated vulnerability in the end. Like the payload was at least complicated because there were certain characters I couldn't use. So I had to find a way to generate these characters in the payload itself and then use them in the final part of the payload to get code execution.
I remember reading your let's say case study or way to reproduce this, and I remember how you reproduce the characters to enter the let's say commands, let's say. But I'm super curious, how exactly were you looking at it? Like what led you to focusing on that area. I understand you were maybe trying to learn new thing for WordPress, but I'm always amazed. How do you systematically or systemically look for vulnerabilities? In general and in this particular plugin too.
Yeah, so for this plugin, this was one of the things I call like a drive-by vulnerability. So I'm looking for something specific, but I don't find that. But I find something that looks interesting. So then I take a bit more of a deeper dive and see what I'm able to do. So that was for this case. More generally, what I do is because most of these plugins are open source and freely available to download. There are these tools called slurpers, which will download all of the plugins and themes from the WordPress.org repo. And then you can do code analysis on your computer, and you can start looking for code that you think might be vulnerable. So what I like to do is, because I've come from a developer background, I like to think about, like, if I was a developer, how could I write something that may accidentally introduce a vulnerability? So PHP is very flexible, and so is WordPress as an extension of that, in that a lot of functions, like, they'll accept in a parameter that you might think, well, this accepts a file path, but it also, you can give it a URL or you can give it a PHP filter, and you might be able to do things that a developer using that function wouldn't have expected you to be able to do.
To translate this to little, like rephrase this, you download automatically all of the plugins, like the repository of what's out there, and in an automatic way you search through potential patterns that you think are most of the time handled wrong way, like without sanitization, or like for example the path. What you look for the path keyword and look where is it used and what's the input and how is it provided from the user inputs, for example, or from other parts of the code, right?
Yeah, so most of the vulnerabilities I've found is through writing regular expressions to find these snippets of vulnerable code. I'll create like a target list of like maybe 100 repositories that have this code in, and I'll just walk through all of the different codes and just rule out any that look like they're not vulnerable, put maybes on the ones that look like they might be vulnerable, and yes is the ones where I think they're probably vulnerable. And then I can go through and install those into a Docker instance I've got with WordPress installed. And then I can start seeing if I can hit that execution path. So I set up tools like Xdebug so I can do debugging and pause execution where I want to. And like, that's a super powerful thing to be able to do, because it's really easy to then find where you're going in the code and to get to where you need to get to try and get that exploit working.
All right, that's super interesting. It's like doing this in a mass way. It's not like you focus on one plugin and read the whole code, trying to figure out what does it, what's it doing, like compiling it in your head rather than looking at a scale, right?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people, when they start looking at like WordPress bug bounty, they will download one plugin hoping to find a vulnerability in it. And like that does work, but you have to spend a lot of time on a specific plugin to be able to get anything, and you may not be rewarded for that, and you may have to just move on to another plugin. So it's quite a slow way of doing it. And because there's in WordPress plugins and themes, there's a lot of copy and pasting from other WordPress plugins and themes. So if you find like one vulnerability, it's likely to be present in quite a few other plugins, maybe written slightly differently, but a lot of the times copy and pasted in. So it's quite a good way of like having a little bounty multiplier for you. So if you make like $200 off one, you might find it 3 or 4 more times and make even more money.
But $200 doesn't sound like a big reward or anything that would make you spend time doing that. And I guess it comes with the scale. like reusing the vulnerability, like if you have the same pattern found on a couple of plugins, because I guess this source can be coming also from places like Stack Overflow, bugs being reintroduced and stuff like this. So
Yeah, so like $100 or so per bug doesn't sound like a lot, but if it takes you like a few minutes, that's actually a really good return on investment. So I've had some bugs where I found one instance of it, and then I found it in about 50 more plugins. So each bug on its own like may only be worth like less than $100, but then it all adds up once you start building on that.
and this is the same bug?
Yeah, exactly the same bug, just different plugins. Yeah.
But what I want to really try. I really want to understand that. So is this the same bug in a sense that this code looks exactly the same, or is it the same type of bug, like not sanitized path, or I don't know, input, something like this, or is it like literally a code taken from Stack Overflow and reused across many plugins?
Yeah, so this one in particular, I found cross-site scripting in themes, and it was almost the exact same code used maybe 50 times in any plugin with more than 1,000 installs. But when I create the regexes, I think it's very useful to create quite a loose regex so that you can match as many of the same kind of vulnerability, even if they've just written it slightly different. Like you might have more spaces, different brackets. Um, there's lots of different ways in PHP of writing the same thing. Like if you've got string concatenation, you can use the dot method, or you can put PHP tags and echo it in there. So there's like 3 or 4 different ways of probably writing the same cross-site scripting vulnerability that I found.
Forgive me for generalization, but if this boils down to writing regexes for very common vulnerabilities, why people aren't using, for example, the same method for writing the code? Like, writing the code in a safety, like with safety in mind, because, for example, in crypto there are code audits. It's very popular where you have a big project, you do the audit, you hire external developers to do the audit, and there are also tools to do the analysis of the code. And I haven't heard about anything like this in PHP world.
So there are definitely code scanners in the PHP world, and I know some plugins are definitely using them because you can see the comments where they're telling the scanner to ignore certain things that they know are safe, or in many cases they think are safe but might necessarily not be. Because sometimes scanning for these ignore this line can be quite a good way to find vulnerabilities where developers are telling the scanner to shut up effectively.
Yeah, they think they are wiser.
Yeah, but in many cases, I think most people just aren't using the code scanners, and that's probably another double-edged sword of the being. There's not really any barrier to entry for a WordPress plugin, so like anyone can go and upload one, which is great for the ecosystem. You get a good amount of diversity, good amount of plugins doing anything, but it does mean that a lot of the source code that's on the WordPress.org repo probably hasn't gone under much code review. I think they do an initial scan when you first upload a plugin, but I don't think there's anything after that for any updates that come to the plugin.
Mm-hmm. And how about updates to the plugins? You download this every, I don't know, 2, 3 days, 7 days maybe, and look for plugins that had added new code, so that you can find something new within that revision only.
Yeah, exactly. So you'll set up your Slurper or your downloader of plugins to continually run, and then you might set up certain alerts. So you might be interested in plugins with over 50,000 installs. If they match any of these regexes, you can give yourself an alert so you can go and investigate them in a bit more detail. One of the other ways of scanning rather than just using regex is to use a tool called Semgrep, which is really good at doing taint analysis, which is following the user input, so from a source to a vulnerable function or a potentially vulnerable function called the sink. So if you're able to write these really specific rules in Semgrep or other kind of tools that do them, I think there's another PHP one called Psalm. But if you can write these really specific rules, you can get a really good you can reduce the amount of false positives, so you're only getting alerts on stuff that is really important to look at. So that's a good way of doing it as well.
And what are your most impactful vulnerabilities found?
Yeah, so the most impactful ones are probably arbitrary file upload. So if you don't check the file extensions properly, there's quite a few ways to mess that up. But if you're a developer, like try and use the functions that WordPress has given you to handle file uploads. If you're trying to use the PHP ones, they are generally less secure, which allows you to upload the users to upload any file type. So they can just upload a PHP file, which can then be executed. So they've got remote code execution. The other one we see a lot of is privilege escalation. So if I, as a subscriber or an unauthentic user, if I can somehow manage to become an admin user through, this tends to be through more of like a logic flaw vulnerability, where they've written something that maybe allows someone to call an endpoint that accepts a role, and then you might be able to arbitrarily set that role and just say, hey, I want to register, but I'm an admin, and it'll let you register as an admin. And then if you get admin access, you can write a PHP file and you can get arbitrary code execution. Those are probably the two big ones we see.
All right. And in terms of impact on the WordPress world, anything apart from WPML that you are most proud of? And I maybe building on top of that, I'm curious, where does the most what are you most proud of in terms of the work you are doing? Is it the most the biggest or most covered plugin, or rather most difficult vulnerability found? What drives you?
Yeah, so I just find it really fun, like finding these vulnerabilities. I've only had a few of the bigger ones, like WPML was probably the biggest one that got picked up. I found some smaller ones in Elementor. But this year, so far I've found about 500 vulnerabilities. So it's kind of it's getting difficult to keep track of them all. But yeah, I just really enjoy looking for them and reporting them. I've also I'm big into the open source world, so I've open sourced some of my vulnerability reports. They're on GitHub. And I'm also trying to give back to the WordPress bug bounty community. I've recently just launched a plugin to try and help bug bounty hunters find and develop exploits in WordPress plugins and themes. So that is also on the same Git repo as the reports that are open sourced.
Wow! How does it work? What value does it bring to the developers?
The plugin, or
yeah, the plugin, yeah, the work you did.
Yeah, so it's like you can get a lot of results and vulnerabilities found from just doing like the code analysis. So as I said, using the regex or Semgrep to find stuff. But there's also a lot of plugins where that won't give you any results because they might be written in a more dynamic way. So your kind of static code tools won't pick stuff up. Like it might be registering REST routes or AJAX endpoints dynamically. So creating those once the plugin's been initialized, and you might not be able to pick that up statically. So this tool is kind of designed to help bug bounty hunters, developers, kind of do the introspection dynamically on the plugin once it's loaded. So you can look at all the shortcodes it's defined. You can click on each shortcode, find the function that it's calling, the same with AJAX endpoints and REST endpoints. And you can just start inspecting those and looking at the code. And it highlights where the user input is and where any of the sync functions that you'd be trying to exploit go to. So it's got this and just a few other little things that kind of aim to speed up development of the exploits.
I'm curious, how did it start for you? So is it something you are focusing 100% now, or is it like side project and something else keeps you busy? How does it work for you?
Yeah, so the plugin I developed, I kind of started working on it because I think I've been a developer for like 15 years or so, and since I've switched to bug bounty, I've kind of missed that development side of it. So that was my reason for coming back into like doing some actual development work. In terms of like getting into bug bounty in general, I started proper full-time bug bounty hunting in January. Because I've been in security for quite a while, but I hadn't managed to break into the bug bounty side of things. But one of my friends sent me some information saying that there were companies that now pay for WordPress vulnerabilities, and I thought that would be a good way to start getting into it. So I started having a go. And the first vulnerability I found was really, really complicated. Had to jump through so many hoops, and I thought, if they're all like this, I'm never gonna make it. But after the first few vulnerabilities, it just started. You learn more about WordPress, you understand how it works and the mistakes developers can make, and so it just kind of snowballed. And yeah, now I'm up to about 500 vulnerabilities. So that's how I got into
Amazing.
it.
So you are focusing on bug bounties since January. Like it's your full-time job now, right?
Yeah, so I probably don't work as hard as if I had an actual full-time job, but yeah, that's what I'm doing to make money now.
All right. And what have you been up to before that? You mentioned that you can't break into the bug bounty world, and was it WordPress also previously, or another development space? Let's say.
Yeah, I've not really been in the WordPress space. I did have a WordPress blog back when I was a teenager, which did get hacked, as I think most people's teenage blogs probably did at the time. So I was aware of WordPress, but I'd never done too much other than messing with like a little bit of PHP themes and stuff. But I kind of fell into being an Android developer shortly after university. And that went really well. I've always had security.
Same here. We also started. Like I also started writing Android and iOS applications
Nice.
out of uni.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, it was really catching. Like I think like the first few Android phones had come out, and I was like, oh, it's Linux on a phone. I'm going to love this. So I just started writing some apps, and they got a bit popular. And I've always had security in my mind, so I've got a semi-popular port scanning tool for Android called PortDroid, which is kind of taken off and made a little bit of money. So I've always been interested in the security side of stuff, but I didn't realize you could properly get paid for working in security until like 5 or 6 years ago, where I did a part-time cybersecurity degree. So didn't learn too much during the degree, but like outside of that, with the people I'd made friends with at university, we did a lot of CTFs and that kind of stuff, which is like hacking competitions for prizes, and ended up learning an awful lot. And I got employed by a cybersecurity training company called Immersive Labs. And after a few promotions there, I was ended up leading the application security team, which I really enjoyed. But then I took a job in fintech for a bit, which didn't last very long. It wasn't really the world for me, and I kind of took a step back and decided that I wanted to focus on stuff I enjoy, which was like finding bugs and teaching.
All right. And because I'm curious, isn't that part where you lead the team for the security, for the application security, isn't tempting you? Or is it like now you have so much freedom that you value this more than, I don't know, working at a company with people where I'm not saying you can't do this, on your own, but I'm just curious from the personal standpoint, how do you compare that to working at the any kind of organization you were working with?
Yeah, I think I did really enjoy my time working with companies, but I think the thing everyone enjoys the most probably about working at a company is the people there, because you have a lot of good people that you work with, or at least I did with all the jobs I've had. Um, but I think you can, like, the thing as I got higher up in promotions, the thing that I enjoyed the most was mentoring people, which is something you don't need a job to do. Like, if you've got that income from somewhere else, there are still people within your community that you can help mentor, help guide. Um, so that's probably one of the justifications for open sourcing my vulnerability reports and the plugin that I've written, to try and give back to the community. There's a few people I've helped mentor to get their first kind of bug bounty reports on patch stack. So there's a few people who help there, and that's really rewarding.
I really like it, and I think we are at the moment in the conversation where I can repackage what you have told us and attack this from the different perspectives. So we talked about you're looking for typical ways of inputting flaws introducing flaws in the code, and the code is written by the developers. And I'm curious how your work and the methods you are using can affect or influence or change the minds, or make an impact or on developers, freelancers, but also developers at the agencies, which are numerous, right? So I'm curious how your work impacts regular developer Joe, let's say.
Yeah, so I think it's quite easy as a developer, especially like if you're more junior, you might receive a vulnerability report and feel like you might take that quite personally. But the reason it's been reported as a vulnerability comes from a good place from the security researcher. They're not trying to say anything negative about you, because everyone makes mistakes. I've written vulnerable code. I've been a developer for so many years. Like, I'm sure a lot of my code is vulnerable. So if they went and looked at my code, they'd probably be able to point out vulnerabilities in mine. So yeah, that's always the first thing I try and cover when talking like to developers or about developers, is that the security researchers are trying to help. So definitely don't take anything personally. And a lot of the vulnerabilities probably come from not considering what can be input to functions, or what can come from user input. Like, pretty much all vulnerabilities are caused by missing sanitization or validation on user input. So there's a lot of stuff that, as a developer, you might not even consider it to be user input. You might have grabbed something from the database expecting it to be already sanitized, but if that's inserted into the database without any sanitization, that value could be controlled by an attacker. And there's lots of like weird and interesting things that an attacker will be able to control that you might not have considered it. But you, like, as a developer, you can put validation on all of your inputs. It's not that difficult or too taxing. So that's the number one way to stop pretty much all vulnerabilities.
But I have to ask, because when I was developing the code, it was like, okay, we have like, look, I have a background in, when I was learning to code, we started with C, and C doesn't let you make any mistakes, right? The application just dies, right? I had to pay a lot of attention all the time to proper memory management and inputs and so on, because app would die. With then Java, not so much, many times, but not so much, and with PHP it's even less, right? So if you start developing with PHP, you are approaching this very relaxed way compared to C. And my feeling is that sanitization or types checks and so on, it's like the last thing people want to do, because this doesn't provide any value. Your app won't be more functional, your app won't have more features, it won't be faster, it will have 10 times more lines of code, because all of the checks, which is like a pain, right? And like this is the natural approach people are coming from, right? So this doesn't help the app be better. It's just for it to even not crash less, right? It's just, proper sanitization. This is so boring. So like, how can you fight that natural inborn urge to cut corners? Like,
Yeah, I mean, some of that is very difficult to try and fix. I mean, if you're coming from an individual developer point of view, that can probably be very hard to change. If you're coming from more of a business point of view, then you've got to evaluate like how much value like the data that you're storing has. Because if you have a vulnerability that an attacker can exploit, if that ends up getting publicity, that might affect the reputation of your company, which might end up resulting in like a drop of sales, which can be the same for individual developers as well. And it can also result if you have a vulnerability in your plugin and you don't respond to the security researchers or the bug bounty programs that might have reported it to you, your plugin can get taken off the WordPress.org repo, which can result in less downloads, and so that can really impact you. So, I mean, it's difficult as a developer. Like, if you're not dedicating time to understanding all your inputs, knowing what you need to sanitize, it can be difficult to change that state of mind. What I will say is some of the sanitizations and protections actually come for free in WordPress. Like if you use some of the functions they've already written, there's a lot of stuff that will already be escaped. You'll be protected. Like if you use WordPress's functions for handling file uploads, those are protected. You won't be able to upload PHP files. And those will actually save you a lot of time because they take all of the things you'd need to do in PHP manually and just put it in one line of code. So I think just education is probably the key part that can help the developers here.
what resonated with me is that don't take it personal. How do you know it's you, right? And then I had that light bulb moment that if you have proper setup, you are using Git, and if your vulnerabilities ties to a given line of code, you can see who has written that line of code. And I had like, I'm amazed how this is helpful to have proper source code repository, well maintained and managed, and all of the proper source code management. How helpful can that be actually?
Yeah, exactly. So I'd very much always try and frame it as like, how can this be a learning opportunity to developer and the development team as a whole, rather than like this developer made a mistake, they need to learn not to do it again, or we're going to fire them. Because it's much better as a learning opportunity. Because if you can tell the developer, yes, this code you've had was vulnerable, this is how you fix it. This is how you could catch it in automation so it doesn't happen again. You're pretty much guaranteeing that they're very unlikely to make that same mistake again. So you've probably made them a much better developer by pointing that out to them.
And you mentioned to use what's already been properly prepared for example, handling files. What else developers can do to avoid mistakes? Let's imagine you're a security consultant. You're hired by big organization. How would you enforce security for their IT processes? Let's say they have a e-commerce platform they own and they want to have everything secured. So how would you enforce security in such an organization?
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite difficult coming in and just starting from zero and trying to get a company up to a good state of security posture. I think I usually like to start with developer education, making sure developers know what to do if they do find a security vulnerability. There's also very easy ways to integrate static code analysis, like SAST scanners, into the CI/CD pipelines. So GitHub Actions are a great one for these. You can just run some free tools in GitHub Actions, get a vulnerability report, and you can just start going through those, triaging the easier ones. So it can be difficult with a lot of false positives, but it's definitely a great way to start and at least catching all the low-hanging fruit.
All right. And how about certifications for organizations like SOC 2 or ISO, anything like this? Like, how useful is that? Is it just for the sake of having a seal of approval, or is it changing anything within the organization?
Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely going to be a good thing. At least the company's getting ready to be certified. I think the one here that a lot of companies get is Cyber Essentials, which is one of the more basic ones that just shows they're protecting against a certain level of basic vulnerabilities. So I think the certification in itself probably wouldn't be too worth too much, but it's the companies getting themselves ready for that certification where the value really comes from, because it's showing that they're at least understanding what security they need to be implementing.
All right. And let's assume you are hiring a web development agency. Like, let's assume our episode is listened to by CMO who has to hire a new agency for website revamp or e-commerce rebuild. How should such a person vet a new agency with security in mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think if you can find a way to make sure that security is something they actually care about or something they actually understand, that could be a real differentiator between them and another company that just wants to pump out the code and move on. Um, so I don't really have too many tips on how you could do that because it's not something I've really done. But it's something that would definitely add value if you were looking for an agency.
What should be the thought process to some extent, to even start thinking on the client side about the security? What should maybe the client ask the agency, or how to even approach this process? Maybe particular questions aren't great way to start, but something else is, how to even
Yeah.
start unpacking this problem.
Yeah, I think maybe just asking them, like, say, give them like a hypothetical, like, you've recently been informed that you've got a security vulnerability in one of the plugins you've written for us. Like, how do you deal with that? And then kind of understanding their thought process, like, are they engaging with the security research, or are they passing it through the proper channels? Are we getting alerted to this? Do we need to go and inform our customers of any potential breaches? That kind of stuff. It would definitely be interesting to see what they think and whether that aligns with what you want as a company that would be hiring them.
But this pose maybe a question or a challenge what the company should be thinking about. Like, right, it's a chicken and egg or hen and egg problem, right? So to understand their thought process, I have to be able to grade their thought process. I have to understand if what they are saying is aligned with what I want, but I don't know what I want because otherwise maybe I would do something different. So what should, like, building on top of it, what should company want in a situation like this, or how the company on the client side, how that company should think about their own infrastructure, their own security approach, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I was the company that was hiring this other company, I would want them to have transparency in their communication with me. So I would want to be informed of the security vulnerability as well as whatever they were doing to fix it. So I think the key thing for me is communication, because you can fix all, like, if you've got a difference of opinions, like what you would want them to do rather than what they're planning to do, that communication is going to be the key there, because you can just ask them to do it differently because they're working for you. So they should be able to, so they should be receptive to that. I think open communication is probably the best thing.
But I'm thinking about the open communication, and isn't it like the lowest, like the bare minimum you would be expecting from any kind of partner, regardless if this is development partner, like any kind of a partner you work with should have that communication top notch, in my, at least, like, in my opinion, right? So like I'm even thinking beyond that, because bad or like semi communication is some very often a no-go, right? A deal breaker, because you can't work effectively with a partner that has poor communication, or like even in some cases like so-so. I'm not even saying about like bad, but even so-so communication is oftentimes a problem. And then the problem happens with the security, and then what, right? So I don't know. I'm thinking about this is the requirement even to go any further with the work. And what about, I don't know, maybe best practices like preventing the bugs to happen? Like, look, I'm fishing for ideas, right? So don't get me wrong, but I want to understand.
Yeah, so I mean, you could look for things like, are they using static code scanners? Are they using continuous deployment and continuous integration? Those kind of things. You could look to see if they have any of the certifications we've mentioned. Those kind of things, just to show that they understand, or at least trying to understand, a correct security posture.
I'm thinking also about one more topic, maybe a little bit adjacent to the security, but still a little bit related. So recently there is that conflict between WordPress founder and WP Engine. I don't want to dig into the conflict, but rather I'm thinking about, let's say, second order consequences. So let's assume there is a fork of WordPress. And I'm curious, what's your opinion on it? Like, if this happens and the fork gets popular, how, in your opinion, would that influence the ecosystem? But maybe how this would impact security of the websites. Do you have any thoughts on it? Any comments?
So I think it is going to complicate things, because it means there's going to be probably two repositories, or I mean, we're already seeing different repositories starting to be set up with all the drama. But it means that as a security researcher, or as the companies that handle the bug bounties for the security researchers, triaging those reports is going to become more difficult, because they're going to have to find different points of contact. And even multiple points of contact if there's a plugin in both repositories. Like, would you contact the WordPress.org security team, or would you contact the other team? It does make everything more complicated. So yeah, I can just see things getting more complex from a security research point of view, from a bug bounty point of view. And it also means if WordPress gets forked and it gets a popular following in the fork, it means any vulnerabilities in WordPress are likely to be present in the fork. So you're going to need to have another program to triage the fork as well. So yeah, you just end up with there's going to be a lot more to do if we start seeing a popular fork emerge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is something I was also thinking about from the perspective of keeping up to date the plugins that will be forked to or not forked, or how do you comply with the, let's say, cores growing or being developed in their own direction, because you can't have the same direction unless you will like copy on an ongoing basis the developments of the core WordPress, and then these new updates would be just copied to the new code base. But what's the point of forking the WordPress this way, right? So my guess is, if this happens and the fork is fork, so for our listeners, fork is a copy of the code. So if the fork is getting popular and maintained and developed actively, it will just diverge from the original, let's say, WordPress, and then we will not have too much compatibility, and plugin makers will have to decide if they are maintaining two versions of their plugins, keeping like doubling the work most of the time. Like I'm very curious how it will unfold.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to know, like especially at this stage, what is going to happen. I would assume that backwards compatibility is going to be very important, even if there's a fork, because like WordPress is very backwards compatible, like almost to its disadvantage when it comes to security. The key value of WordPress comes from the amount of plugins and themes that are available. So I think any fork would probably have to follow a similar, like very backwards compatible nature with WordPress. I guess over time it is something that would diverge, but I think for short to medium term, you'd definitely be looking at them both being very compatible with each other.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it can be a likely scenario that the fork will be not one but many purpose-driven or purpose-focused forks, like commerce WordPress, or like instead of Woo, everything gets merged and this is commerce WordPress, or there is publisher WordPress, or there is speed WordPress, or like with simplified cut to like fitting the very purpose admin panel, uncluttered, let's say, very lean, maybe with integrated plugins. I don't know. I'm just inventing this as I speak. Anything like this could be possible?
I mean, it could definitely be possible. From a security point of view, it could be beneficial to have more of a team on a narrower focus. So they've got less of that flexibility that can introduce more of the bugs. But yeah, I don't think it's anything I could predict with any certainty at the moment.
Sure. I'm thinking about wrapping the episode with any maybe horror stories you remember you would like to share, something that was crazy.
I've probably got a few things here. So PatchStack this month removed their minimum for 1K installs in plugins and themes, so you could report anything that was still active on the WordPress.org repo. So I've reported about 120 vulnerabilities this month, so I'm quite tired now, but I found lots, and I was really focusing on the high impact vulnerabilities. So I found a lot of file uploads, privilege escalations, those kind of things were the main things I was looking at. So I've seen a few like really silly things this month. There was at least 3 plugins that did this in slightly different ways, but every endpoint in WordPress, you could put at the end of the URL, you could put $ID equals 1, and you would become the admin user. So,
wow.
Yeah, and
via session cookie, or how would it happen?
It would just update the session cookie to log you in as admin straight away. So you just go to any URL in WordPress, put $ID equals 1, bam, press enter, you're admin.
That's wonderful. How do you do this? How do you do this? Like what happened behind the scenes? How that ID number 1 parameter changed for the admin? There was a user in the user list that with the ID of number 1, and by the mistake you would get promoted to that user.
Yeah, so like in almost every WordPress setup, your administrator user will have ID 1. Like very occasionally you'd need to enumerate that, but that's something you could find out very easily, and WordPress exposes a lot of user information like that without authentication. So you can get a user ID, you can probably find out an admin user ID. And it's difficult to always know the developer's justification in writing some code. I know in one of the plugins, they defined a load of REST routes, which inherited from an abstract REST route class. And in the initialization for that REST route class, they had the ability to provide a parameter which would change the user ID. So I assume that this was something they might have put in for testing, or if there was some sort of admin functionality where they needed to hit REST routes as different users. So that one just made every REST route be able to instantly log in as admin, and it would return the cookie. So then you could use that to log into the normal admin panel. I saw some others that were in. So some plugins will deliberately give you the ability as admin to log in as other users to see what the panel looks like, and then give you the ability to switch back to admin. And it's quite easy to mess that up. If you've got a button you can click to go back to being admin, you might not necessarily need to have been admin previously for you to be able to press that button and take over an admin account. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of silly coding mistakes I found. And because that install count was much lower, you get to see a lot of the stuff that hasn't really had many eyes looking over it. And when I went into it, I was thinking, these are all going to be plugins that have become abandoned and no one's looked at for like 10, 15 years. And like some of them definitely were, but there was a surprising amount of them that have just been updated in the past few months. And they've got these massive critical vulnerabilities in that allow anyone to suddenly become admin with no authentication.
Stealthcopter, right? So that's your nickname. You're known in the security space by this nickname. And I wanted to start the conversation with you telling us how you picked that nickname, but I think we can wrap up the conversation with that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so this was a long time ago. So back when I was a teenager, everyone kind of had nicknames for the computer games they're playing. And so I ended up going with Stealthcopter because there's a certain computer game I was playing at the time had an invisible tank called a stealth tank, and I was like, it'd be cool if you could just have a stealth helicopter. So it was Stealthcopter.
I like the nickname, by the way. So I think this is one of the cooler nicknames I came across. So, and I mean it. So I really like it.
Yeah, it's very difficult once you've got one to stop using it.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, so much history associated with that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. This was a very fun conversation. I enjoyed it very much, and I learned a couple of things too. So thank you very much. Oh, one more thing I want to ask. I remember now. So you had to write. You mentioned that you reported around 100 vulnerabilities this month. Does this mean you had to also write 100 reports for every bug you found?
Yeah, so that can be quite a taxing thing, just writing the reports. But because so many of these reports are the same, I've started working on templates that I can just reuse between reports.
And AI help in for writing them?
Yeah, AI can be very helpful. I wouldn't like completely rely on it, but it is good at like if you want to give it a set of bullet points, like I've done this, this, and this. How would you best describe this? Like summarize this in the best way possible. And I've helped quite a lot of people who are kind of newer to the bug bounty world write their vulnerability reports in a way that can, because you really want the summary to give a high level impact for anyone that's reading it, because that needs to be read by the triages so they can understand what the impact of your vulnerability is, but also by the companies that receive these vulnerability reports and need to action them. So it's important to them so that they can understand, like, what does this actually mean for us as a company? Is it something we have to go and fix immediately? Can we take a few days? Can we take a few weeks? Do we need to go and contact our customers, get them to urgently install a security fix? So I find the language in that is very important, to not write it as like a bug bounty hunter, but to be able to write it in a way that can communicate to those stakeholders in a company and something to the triages so they can understand.
Plain English, right?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of like keeping everything as simple as possible.
All right. Okay. Now I'm out of questions. So thank you again very much. Good luck with your hunting, and take care.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
If you like what you've just heard, don't forget to subscribe for more episodes. On the other hand, if you've got a question we haven't answered yet, feel free to reach out to us directly. Just go to osomstudio.com/contact. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next episode of the Awesome to Know podcast.